Welcome to today's Explainer. You know that feeling like everything in politics right now is completely unprecedented and just endlessly chaotic? Yet you're absolutely not alone in feeling that way. So let's treat this like a crash course. Think of this as a political science lecture, where we're going to put on our academic lenses, look past the daily headlines, cut through the noisy debates, and actually dissect the deeper structural forces driving all this chaos.
Okay, let's dive right in by asking the foundational question of our lecture today. Is there a single, intentional, driving force behind the political turmoil we see every single day? Or are we just witnessing a broader, systemic breakdown? People look at the news and constantly ask, what's the endgame here? Well, to answer that objectively, we have to look through the distinct analytical frameworks that political scientists actually use to study this exact kind of chaos.
But before we get into specific theories, we really have to define our baseline symptom, and that is a deep crisis of legitimacy. We're talking about a foundational loss of public faith, where everyday citizens believe the system is just fundamentally unfair, that their votes literally do not matter, and that elites are inherently corrupt. Honestly, this crisis is the oxygen. It is the fuel for all the public anger, the intense polarization, and the wild political volatility we're experiencing today.
Here is our syllabus for today. We're going to start with that crisis of legitimacy, move right through polarization, oligarchy, and institutional decay, take a look at the economics of turmoil, and wrap it all up with contradictory political endgames. The goal today is to use these academic lenses to take what feels like completely random chaos and turn it into a structured, observable study of political decay.
All right, Section 1, a crisis of legitimacy, the oxygen of political volatility. Let's examine how this core loss of trust actually undermines the foundation of our government institutions.
So what does this lost legitimacy actually do? Well, the fallout is massive. When citizens perceive an overarching loss of system fairness and hold this deep-seated conviction that elites are just fundamentally corrupt, it drastically changes political behavior. You see this manifesting constantly in the real world, either through mass voter apathy or, on the flip side, the explosive rise of fringe internet movements. It fuels a really dangerous feedback loop of populist anger and conspiracy theories. Think about it. When people firmly believe the game is rigged, it creates incredibly fertile ground for extreme, anti-institutional narratives to take root and spread like wildfire.
Moving along to Section 2, Polarization and Democratic Erosion, the Cold Civil War. Let's evaluate how this intense tribalism directly impacts our current legislative functionality. As an analytical observer, you can clearly see how affective polarization, which is basically a deep, visceral dislike of the opposing party, drives modern political behavior. And putting my professor hat on for a second to critique our modern ecosystem, media fragmentation actively accelerates and financially rewards this extreme partisanship. It creates this incredibly rigid feedback loop that basically blocks any chance of legislative compromise. The intent of political actors completely shifts away from functional governance and entirely toward tribal victory. I mean, consider our current legislative gridlock, the stalls over the debt ceiling, or the total inability to pass comprehensive infrastructure or border policies. This is exactly how polarization manifests in the real world.
Okay, Section 3, oligarchy and wealth concentration, preserving elite interests. We're going to shift our focus to economic power now and see how elite wealth concentration actively shapes and restricts legislative policy outcomes.
To really grasp this, we have to contrast two very distinct frameworks, the oligarchic power model versus the structural decay model. The oligarchic model argues that the core driver here is the concentration of economic power by wealthy elites, with a very intentional endgame of preserving a system that exclusively benefits the top 1%. Their mechanism? Heavy corporate lobbying for favorable tax and regulatory policies. Now, compare that to the structural decay model. This model says the driver is actually built-in constitutional design flaws, which leads to a totally unintentional slide into crisis through mechanics like gridlock and gerrymandering.
So the crucial takeaway here, especially looking through that oligarchic lens, is how wealth concentration truly impacts functionality. Get this. Cultural polarization actually serves as a strategic distraction from economic redistribution. By keeping voters endlessly locked in a cultural cold civil war, billionaires and corporate lobbyists ensure that no matter which party is in charge, capital-favorable policies remain completely untouched. This elite influence acts as a massive structural barrier. It intentionally diverts the government's attention away from passing any meaningful public interest legislation.
Bringing us to Section 4, Conspiracy versus Institutional Decay,
narrative versus observable reality. Here, we need to objectively contrast popular conspiracy perspectives with the institutional failures we can actually observe.
Take the incredibly popular deep state narrative. This theory assumes there's a highly coordinated, intentional plot by elite career bureaucrats trying to defeat populist threats. Contrast that narrative with observable structural decay. In this reality, systemic failure is driven by centuries-old constitutional design flaws, like the rigidity of the Electoral College or extreme partisan gerrymandering. Under this framework, political actors pursuing short-term partisan survival inadvertently accelerate institutional collapse. It's not a secret cabal pulling strings in a smoky room. It's a flawed constitutional system naturally breaking down under immense pressure.
And we can see the symptoms of this structural decay everywhere. Severe legislative gridlock, increasingly contested elections, officials outright refusing to certify democratic results, and outbreaks of actual social and political violence. The systemic incentives within Congress prioritize short-term survival over actual governance. When we compare this checklist to historical periods of democratic breakdown, like the collapse of the Weimar Republic or 19th-century democracies in South America, these are textbook indicators of a regime in serious peril.
Section 5. The Economics of Turmoil. Inequality as a Driver of Decay. Let's see how economic inequality serves as a primary systemic engine for all this political decay.
There's a systemic leftist critique that offers a really powerful explanation of how wealth concentration specifically functions to destabilize the social contract. It argues that economic instability isn't just some unfortunate side effect. It is the root cause eroding democratic rights and fueling the chaos. When inequality deepens, it fractures society right down to your local community. It opens the door for far-right movements, political violence, and overall democratic erosion. It's all deeply connected.
All right, almost at the end here. Section 6. Contradictory political endgames, competing visions for America's future. Finally, let's summarize why these different ideological groups are pushing for completely contradictory endgames for American political turmoil.
Through the polarization lens, the endgame is total victory in a cold civil war. For conservatives, that means securing a lasting conservative Supreme Court majority, rewriting electoral rules, and taking total control of local election administration. On the flip side, for liberals, the endgame involves packing the courts, abolishing the legislative filibuster, and utilizing federal power to override state-level policies. Both sides are absolutely willing to aggressively alter foundational institutional rules just to ensure their specific tribe defines the nation's future.
When you track this overall trajectory, a pretty terrifying step-by-step process emerges. Step 1. Actors pursue short-term partisan gain just to survive politically. Step 2. Those exact actions inadvertently worsen systemic, built-in weaknesses. Step 3. The system slides into severe crisis until it eventually collapses, gets reformed, or is overthrown. This trajectory perfectly mirrors the historical collapses we discussed a minute ago, where short-term, self-interested logic blindly drives a nation right off a cliff toward long-term institutional collapse.
And that brings us to our core conclusion. The current political turmoil we're living through is not the result of a single secret committee pulling the strings in the shadows. Rather, it is the symptom of multiple systems, political, economic, and media, all failing simultaneously. Ultimately, what you should take away from this explainer today is that the chaos we observe daily is actually a highly predictable result of interconnected institutions breaking down under the immense weight of economic inequality, structural flaws, and profound public distrust.
So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder as our lecture concludes. Are we actually capable of addressing these structural flaws and interrupting these destructive dynamics through massive systemic reform? Or are we simply watching the inevitable endgame of institutional decay unfold into a fundamental reordering of the American political system? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, remember to keep critically examining the structures around you.